She wasn't allowed in the room, but genius never asks for permission. January in Boston is a kind of cold that forgets mercy. The wind slithered through the worn stone steps of Harvard University, whispering around the old red-brick buildings that stood like monuments to time. Inside the long corridor of Maxwell Hall, an elderly man with silver hair quietly pushed a mop cart. His name was Luis Rivera. For over 30 years he had worked as a janitor at Harvard, faceless, voiceless, known only by the brief, dismissive name people muttered like calling for a tool, Janitor Lou. Beside him tonight walked his granddaughter, Sophie Rivera, age 11. She was not enrolled, not a student, not even supposed to be in the building. Her mother worked night shifts at a hospital far out of town. Her father had died in a construction accident when she was still in diapers. Sophie lived with her grandfather ever since her grandmother passed away from cancer. And on nights like this, when there was no one else to watch her, Sophie followed Lou into the quiet hallways like a small shadow behind an old man. They entered classroom 211. The fluorescent lights buzzed a pale blue above rows of long tables. It was a graduate-level seminar, mostly PhD candidates and postdoctoral researchers, the kind of minds that dream in symbols and think in theorems. Sophie found a hidden seat in the back corner, curling into the shadows the way children do when they know they don't belong. She pulled from her backpack an old notebook, worn at the edges and soft at the spine. Sophie began to draw, not people, not houses, spirals, coils, shapes that moved like waves or petals, or the silent spinning of air. Each line was a motion, each curve a whisper of something unseen. This was Sophie's language, a language without words, one that only her grandmother used to understand. Then the door opened. Professor Langston Hale entered the room. He needed no introduction. A towering name in theoretical mathematics, Hale had published work on quantum manifold structures that forced even the algebraic geometry community to rethink their assumptions. Tall, lean, silver-haired, and cold-eyed, he did not suffer mediocrity, nor did he coddle the slow. And tonight, he wasn't there to lecture. He came to lay down a challenge. On the board, he began to write, a long, curling integral that slithered across the blackboard like a labyrinth. He turned and said, "This is an open problem. A formulation in second-order differential curvature over a nonlinear Riemannian manifold. It has no known solution. MIT, Princeton, Caltech, they've all tried. I expect no answers. Only effort." The room fell still. One student rose, attempted a few lines, and sat back down. Another mumbled something about variational principles and gave up. The brightest minds in the room barely made it out of the gate, tangled in symbols and lost in the forest of formalism. Sophie didn't know the name of those theorems. She didn't know what a manifold was. But to her, the blackboard was not a riddle. It was a canvas. To Sophie, mathematics had never started with numbers. It started with form. When she was little, her grandmother had stretched strings across the red dirt of their tiny backyard to show her the golden spirals of sunflower seeds. "Math," she had whispered, "is not in books. It's in the way the universe curls inward to speak." Sophie stared at the board. She saw not straight lines, but spin. Not an equation, but a dance. And inside her mind, something began to click into place. Not through definitions, but through shape. She lowered her head and drew again in her notebook. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady, bright. Lou looked at his granddaughter. He recognized that look. The same gaze Elena had years ago when she would sit for hours solving puzzles clipped from old newspapers. The same gaze that once told him, Some children see what grown-ups forget. If we are quiet enough, they will show us. And tonight, that light returned. Not in a lecture hall, but in a small girl hiding in the back of a room never meant for her. In a soft whisper, Sophie said in Spanish, "They're trying to push it straight, but it's turning, Grandpa." Lou swallowed hard. He didn't understand the formula, but he understood that his granddaughter had just seen something no one else in that room could. She hadn't solved the problem, but she had spotted the door, and the door had a spiral key. One student halfway down the aisle turned around and glimpsed Sophie's notebook. He squinted. Perfect, simple spirals. A visual model that hinted at a transformation. One that the mess of abstract expressions on the board had failed to reveal. But he turned away. Who would take seriously the scribbles of a janitor's granddaughter? Only Lou kept looking, because Lou knew something was beginning. All his life he had mopped the edges of greatness, never daring to imagine that something of him could leave a mark in these marble halls. But his granddaughter, little Sophie, she might do what the rest of the world never even dared to see, because genius never knocks. It doesn't wait for invitations. It needs only a piece of paper, a quiet mind, and someone willing to see what others have ignored. In the shadows, Sophie kept drawing. The equation remained unsolved. But the story had already begun, and all it took was a child who was never supposed to be in that room. It wasn't a riddle to her. It was a rhythm. The silence in Maxwell Hall grew heavier, almost sacred. Chalk dust still floated in the air from Hale's final stroke, but no one dared approach the board. Not anymore. A few students flipped through dense notebooks, hoping for inspiration. Others stared down, lost in thought, or quietly packed their things. The open problem on the board felt more like a wall now, a wall none could climb. But in the far corner, one pair of eyes remained fixed. Not on the wall, but on the pattern behind it. Sophie Rivera sat with her notebook open, now halfway filled with sketches. Spirals, cross-sections, notations of her own invention. She was not transcribing the formulas she saw, she was translating them like music heard in another key. To her, the equation was not a cage of symbols. It moved. It pulsed. It breathed. Her grandfather, Lou, sat beside her, frozen. He had seen Sophie drift into this state only a handful of times, usually while drawing patterns in the dirt behind their old trailer, or after watching a windmill turn in silence for hours. It was the same stillness, the same clarity. On the board, Hale's integral still stretched across the chalk. A second-order Laplace operator, defined over a nonlinear Riemannian manifold, with boundary conditions that confounded traditional Fourier methods. The kind of problem that exhausted even top minds. "Come on," muttered a student near the front. "You'd need to reinterpret the whole geometry to even begin." Another whispered, "This thing's got symmetry breaking all over it." But they were trying to flatten it, trying to force it into a framework it refused to belong to. Sophie, meanwhile, saw something else entirely. She saw a spiral, not a path. She saw recursion, not reduction. And she saw a shape, not a solution. One of the students noticed her again. He tapped the shoulder of the girl beside him and pointed subtly toward the back. "That kid's still here. What is she doing?" The girl shrugged. "She's drawing, doodling, maybe." But it wasn't doodling, not to Sophie. In her notebook, she had drawn a series of nested loops, spirals within spirals, and from those she mapped out gradient flows, which she instinctively balanced around internal fixed points. Without knowing the name for it, she had constructed a primitive spiral topology, a way to view curvature not as external deformation, but as internal growth. The integral on the board, to her, was not a question of solving. It was a question of listening. Suddenly, she looked up. The room had begun to move again. Backpacks zipped. Chairs scraped. Hale was gathering his materials, preparing to close the seminar. But Sophie stood up. She moved quietly down the aisle. Her boots barely made a sound on the linoleum floor. Her hands clutched the notebook as if it were a lantern, not paper. One step, then another. The classroom noticed. A student furrowed his brow. Wait, is she coming up here? No way. She can't, right? Lou sat frozen. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He had not told her to stop. He had not told her to go. But somehow he knew. This was one of those moments that defines a life. Sophie reached the edge of the lecture platform. Professor Hale turned. His eyes locked on hers. The room went still. And Sophie, trembling but steady, raised her hand, not to speak, but to write. No, someone whispered. She's not. She was. With gentle fingers, she took a stick of chalk from the tray. It felt cold and dry. The room was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Sophie stepped to the board. Hale didn't stop her. He didn't move. He didn't even seem angry. He simply watched. She began to draw, but not symbols, not equations. She drew a curve, one smooth spiral, beginning from a single point near the left edge of the board and unfurling like a fern. The arc continued until it wrapped near the boundary of the integral itself. Then another, coiled around the first. Some of the students laughed softly. "What is this?" one murmured. A child's drawing. But another leaned forward. "Wait. Look. She's aligning it." Sophie shifted slightly. Her hands worked without hesitation now. The spiral nested into the structure of the manifold itself, occupying the abstract space left undefined in Hale's formulation. She wasn't solving the equation. She was reframing it. A new coordinate lens. A student in the front stood up. "Hold on. That shape, it's a transformation map." Professor Hale stepped forward, his brow tense. "Explain," he said, but not to her, to himself. Because he saw it too. The child had rotated the field, turned the curvature inward. It was something like a Mobius translation, but smoother, organic. She wasn't using linear logic. She was using topological rhythm. The laughter stopped. The silence returned. But this time, it was reverent. Sophie stepped back, placed the chalk down gently and walked away from the board. No applause, no protest. Just the stunned quiet of a room that had seen something shift. Hale turned to the board, speechless. He stared at the spiral. Then he looked down at the notes in his own folder. They were wrong, not in result, but in perspective. And from the back of the room, Lou closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember. Elena would have cried. And maybe, if this place had a soul, so would Harvard. It wasn't her classroom, but the board was waiting for her. The room had emptied. Students filed out in silence, some whispering, some glancing back at the board as if still unsure whether they had imagined what they had seen. Professor Hale remained, unmoving, a tall statue in the flickering fluorescent light. The spiral Sophie had drawn stayed on the blackboard, delicate but defiant, a silent revolt against convention. Lou approached slowly, hesitantly. Sophie walked beside him, holding her notebook close to her chest. She did not look proud. She did not smile. She simply looked tired. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Hale blinked. It was the first motion he'd made in minutes. He looked down at her, truly looked, as if for the first time. "You drew that," he said. Not a question, a reckoning. Sophie nodded. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just saw something." Hale glanced at the board, then at her, then at Lou, who stood with both hands wrung tight in front of him, as if ready to apologize for merely existing. "You're not a student here," Hale said quietly. "No, sir," Lou answered. "She's my granddaughter. My daughter works nights. I didn't want to leave her home alone. She shouldn't be in this class." "I know." Sophie lowered her eyes. "I can stop. I won't come again." But Hale didn't respond. He looked at the spiral again, not just at its form, but at what it implied. He saw how it folded the boundary space, how it gave the integral a natural flow, how it simplified without erasing. It wasn't just an artistic interpretation. It was the foundation of a new approach. She didn't break the problem. She bent the space around it. He turned back to her. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I didn't," Sophie said. "I just followed it." Lou interjected, voice gentle. "Her grandmother used to draw shapes in the dirt. She taught math to middle school kids, real poor schools. Sophie watched her for hours." Hale exhaled, as though hearing something familiar in that story. As though somewhere, long ago, someone had also taught him something not found in books. He reached for the chalk. "You started with this curve here?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Show me." Again. She hesitated, then stepped forward. Hale moved aside. With trembling fingers, she redrew the spiral. The motion was slower now, deliberate. She spoke softly as she worked. "This curve wraps in on itself. I thought maybe, instead of projecting the flow outward, it could grow inward. The center becomes a fixed point. If you let the curvature rotate, the field stabilizes." She said the words like a child explaining why clouds move. Simply, honestly, without pretense. Hale stared. It was not just intuition. It was insight. The kind you couldn't teach. Only witness. He backed away. "I need to think," he murmured. Then he turned and left the room without another word. That night, back at their small apartment above a laundromat, Lou warmed a can of soup while Sophie sat by the window, notebook in lap, eyes distant. She didn't speak. She hadn't since they left Harvard. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked finally. Lou stirred the pot and shook his head. "No, mija. You showed them something true. That can make people uncomfortable." "Should I stop?" Lou turned. "No, but you should be careful. The world isn't always kind to truth, especially when it comes from the wrong place." Sophie nodded quietly. She turned back to her notebook. In it, she began a new page. This time, not a spiral, but a bridge. Arches crossing over a valley. Beneath it, water swirled. The next evening, when Lou returned to Maxwell Hall, the board had been erased. The spiral was gone. But something else had changed. A folded note was left at the edge of the podium. It read, "Bring her back. One more time. Signed, Langston Hale." She didn't need to explain. The math spoke for her. The next night, the air in Maxwell Hall was different. It wasn't just curiosity that filled the room. It was something heavier. A hush of waiting, of watching, of wondering. The kind of silence that falls not before a performance, but before a storm of truth. When Sophie walked in behind Lou, heads turned. Not with malice. Not yet. But with that edge of academic skepticism that often greets the uninvited. Some eyes held amusement. Some pity. A few, something closer to discomfort. The kind people feel when their idea of order is quietly challenged. She looked even smaller this time. Hair pulled back into a tight braid. The same faded backpack. The same quiet eyes, wide with awareness. She carried nothing but her notebook and the memory of spirals. Professor Hale stood at the board, already mid-sentence when they entered. But he paused, just for a moment. He looked at her. Then, almost without thinking, he gestured to the second row. One seat was empty. Sophie took it. A few students exchanged glances. One leaned to another. He's letting her stay? Guess we're letting children audit grad seminars now. Soft laughter. Nothing cruel. But enough to remind the room of hierarchy. Of order. Of what was supposed to be. Hale ignored it. Or pretended to. He turned to the board. We're going to revisit the problem from last night, he said, voice calm but firm. But with a shift in orientation. The room quieted. Markers scraped. Laptops clicked open. Fingers hovered over keys. This, he said, pointing to the rewritten integral, now exists within a restructured domain. The spiral mapping from earlier has been preserved. Preserved. He didn't say who drew it. He didn't say her name. But Sophie heard the word like a window opening. Hale stepped back. I want us to consider this not as a closed problem, but as a living structure. The vector field rotates, not collapses. We aren't imposing a solution. We're revealing a path. That was her idea. The chalk passed through hands. Students began trying variations. Some reverted to old methods. Most struggled. Some improved the notation, clarified a symbol or two. But none of them saw what she saw. Then Hale turned to Sophie. Would you show them? Silence. Sophie froze. The entire room turned to her. 30 pairs of eyes, some doubtful, some intrigued. A few quietly hostile. She looked at Lou. He gave a small nod from the back, steady, quiet, present. She stood, walked slowly to the board. No gasps, no applause. Only watching. The board was half filled with suggestions. Fragments of logic, attempts at mapping curvature across boundary loss. Sophie erased none of it. She picked up a stick of chalk. Her fingers, so small against the vast blackboard, barely left dust behind. She began where Hale had paused. At first it looked simple. A curve, then an arc. One of the students snickered. Just let her doodle, I guess, someone whispered. Another chuckled. But then her hand shifted. She drew a second spiral, not mirroring the first, but intersecting it. A dynamic pairing. She labeled a fixed point. Then, slowly, she added vector lines. Not just flowing outward, but folding inward. And the board changed, visibly, irrefutably. A hush fell. The laughter ceased. Wait, someone whispered. That's consistent with the Ritchie decay she predicted. Another leaned forward. She stabilized the flow using inner rotation. I didn't even think that was viable. Look at how she mapped the curvature into a closed field. That's not classical topology. That's new. Hale said nothing, arms folded, eyes fixed on the board. Sophie stepped back. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. The math spoke for her. The board, once a battlefield of confusion, now looked like a window, a map, a living geometry, not resolved but awakened. The students sat frozen, not because they understood everything, but because they knew, in the marrow of their minds, that something true had just been revealed. It wasn't an answer. It was a path. Hale slowly walked to the board. He traced one of the spirals with his finger, almost reverently. Then he looked at Sophie. "Where did you learn this?" Sophie shrugged, eyes low. "I didn't. I just saw it." "Have you studied topology?" She shook her head. "Differential geometry? Tensor analysis?" "No, sir." One of the students, Clara, a doctoral candidate known for her precision, raised a hand. "Professor, can I ask a question?" Hale nodded. "Who exactly is she?" The room waited. No one breathed. Lou stood slowly. "She's my granddaughter. Her name is Sophie Rivera. Her mom works night shifts at the hospital. I clean this building." No one spoke. "And yes," Lou added, "she wasn't supposed to be here." A pause. Then Hale said quietly, "Neither was this solution." He turned back to the board. And yet here it is. The rest of the seminar passed in stunned quiet. No more laughter, no more snickering, just the scratching of pens and the flicker of thought. Later that night, as they walked through the cold air back to their apartment, Sophie looked up at Lou. "Do you think I did something wrong?" Lou smiled, pulling his jacket tighter around her shoulders. "No, mija. I think you did something rare." Sophie nodded slowly. In her notebook, a new spiral began to form. This time not in ink, but in memory. The memory of a room that tried to laugh her away. And then listened. They erased her name. But not her work. The next morning, an email arrived in the inbox of Clara Meyer, the doctoral student who had questioned Sophie's identity. It was from Miles Vance, a teaching assistant under Professor Hale, young, ambitious, and rarely noticed until now. Subject: Spiral Structure Notes. Urgent attached was a high-resolution image of the blackboard Sophie had drawn on. Spiral mappings, fixed-point vectors, and the elegant symmetry she had introduced, preserved in crisp monochrome. But one thing was missing: her name. Miles had cropped the photo just so. No trace of Sophie's handwriting, no angle showing her beside the board. Just the math. The clean, undeniable shape of a new idea. And no one to credit for it. Clara replied within minutes. "This isn't your work." Miles responded with a smiley face emoji and one line, "It's ours now." That afternoon, he uploaded a draft of a paper to a private research forum used by graduate scholars across Ivy League institutions. The paper was titled, "Spiral Manifold Dynamics and Nonlinear Contraction Fields." Authors: Vance, Meyer, Halber, Yang. There was no mention of Sophie Rivera, no acknowledgement of the child, no whisper of chalk in a stranger's hand. Back in their apartment, Sophie sat on the floor with her notebook open to a blank page. She wasn't drawing. She was staring. Lou poured her some tea and sat beside her. "You all right, mija?" She nodded, but her hands didn't move. Her spiral had stopped. "I saw Clara take a picture," she said. "And Miles. He was writing things down." Fast. Lou said nothing. She looked up at him. Does it matter? If they take it? He thought for a moment. Only if you stop drawing. She closed the notebook. I'm tired. Meanwhile, in another corner of Harvard, Professor Hale sat at his desk. He'd received the same draft paper, saw the diagrams, the equations. He recognized the work instantly. His hand hovered over the keyboard. He considered writing to the department, to the ethics board, but something, doubt, pride, fear, held him. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. She shouldn't have been in the room, but neither should the truth have come from a child. A week passed. The forum buzzed. Other faculty began referencing the spiral field model. Some praised it, some critiqued, but none questioned its originality. Miles and his team gave a recorded presentation over Zoom. Clara stayed silent, eyes lowered, while Miles explained the logic like it had arrived fully formed in his own mind. Sophie didn't return to Maxwell Hall. She didn't ask why. She just stopped showing up. But her notebook kept growing, quietly, secretly. Spirals evolved into lattices, vector fields into phase portraits. What she once saw as play now turned to discipline, her grandmother's ghost guiding every line. Then, one evening, Lou found something in her backpack. A letter, folded, unaddressed. He opened it. It was written in Sophie's tiny, careful script. To the professors who used my drawing, I don't want to fight. I just want to learn. You don't have to give me credit. Just don't lie, because math is supposed to be true. Lou stared at it for a long time, then folded it again and slid it into his coat pocket. Days later, Clara knocked on Professor Hale's office door. He looked up, surprised. She entered slowly, holding something in her hand. It was a printout of the forum paper. I need to withdraw my name, she said quietly. Hale sat upright. Why? You know why. He nodded. She's not in this school, he said. She's not protected. She's not protected, Clara agreed. But she's right. She left the paper on his desk and walked out. The door clicked shut. Hale sat in silence. Then he reached for his desk drawer and pulled out Sophie's forgotten notebook, the one Lou had left in his office weeks earlier. He opened to the page with the original spiral. It was more than elegant. It was foundational. And in the margin, in pencil so faint it nearly disappeared, was her name. Sophie Rivera. She didn't just solve the problem. She saw the world behind it. It was nearly midnight when Lou stepped out onto the fire escape for air, the letter still folded in his coat pocket. Below him, the city was a sea of broken windows, soft light, and the rumble of night shift buses. He lit a cigarette, a habit he had dropped years ago but kept one in emergencies. Tonight felt like one. Inside, Sophie lay curled on the couch, finally asleep, the notebook clutched against her chest. She hadn't drawn anything new in days, not since the silence that followed, not since the math she'd uncovered began walking around campus without her name. He looked up at the stars, sparse, pale dots in a sky washed out by street lamps and sodium vapor. Still, they were there, always had been. Sophie, he whispered to the sky, they don't see what I see. The next morning, while Lou worked an early shift buffing the marble floors of the Maxwell Rotunda, Sophie stayed home. The heater rattled. The apartment smelled faintly of old tea and graphite. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her notebook open, but untouched. She remembered the way the chalk had felt in her hand. the cool, smooth cylinder, the weight of the room watching, the spiral she had drawn. She remembered how her hand had stopped shaking halfway through, how she had felt, for just a moment, that she wasn't alone, as though her grandmother had been standing behind her, whispering without words. She flipped back through her pages. Spirals gave way to lattices, lattices to fields. And then, something new. Something she hadn't remembered drawing. A shape. It was rough, almost a blur. But there it was. Two spirals, nested around a shared axis, folding into themselves, not in opposition, but in balance. A counterpoint. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a principle. She stared at it for a long time. That afternoon, Professor Hale walked alone to the mathematics library. He carried two things, the forum printout and Sophie's notebook. He moved slowly, stopping at the reference section, running his fingers along the spines of texts he had memorized decades ago. Tensors, Ricci flows, differential forms. And then, finally, the shelves of open problems, journals collecting the unsolved, the unproven, the waiting. He sat. He opened her notebook again. That page, the page with the spiral, the counter-spiral, the inward motion, stared back at him like a face he couldn't forget. It wasn't just elegant. It was predictive. The dynamic field she'd implied, though incomplete, corresponded to a conjecture in a decades-old paper buried in an obscure Russian journal, one he himself had read and dismissed years ago. Too theoretical, he had thought then. No concrete application. But Sophie's shape gave it breath. He copied the sketch, then did the math. An hour passed, then two. And when he looked up, there was sweat on his brow. He whispered to no one. She saw it. God help me. She actually saw it. At home, Sophie began drawing again. Not to prove, not to impress, to understand. The twin spirals became anchors in a broader field. She labeled the angles, tested gradients, played with force diagrams. Her lines became cleaner, more precise. With every page, the pattern spoke louder. A closed system, a conserved flow, a truth beneath symmetry. When Lou came home, she barely noticed. He set down his bag, watched her for a while. Then he placed something next to her on the floor. A new pack of pencils. She smiled. It was the first in days. That night, in the Harvard faculty lounge, Hale met privately with a retired professor, Dr. Ephraim Linwood, once a rising star in mathematical physics, now half forgotten and mostly content with crosswords. Hale showed him the diagram. Linwood's eyebrows rose. Where did this come from? A student, Hale said. A doctoral student? Hale hesitated. Not exactly. They worked together in silence for an hour. Linwood retrieved an old paper of his own, unpublished, about singularity folding in hyperbolic domains. The mathematics echoed Sophie's structure. Not exactly, but close. Like a musical variation on a theme written decades apart. Linwood leaned back, awed. Langston, this is a shift. Not just a tweak. A new framework. Hale closed the notebook gently. She's 11. Linwood stared, then said, So was Mozart. The next day, Hale walked into his lecture and did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He erased his own equation. Then he rewrote Sophie's diagram. And below it, in clear letters, Spiral Contraction Mapping. Rivera Model. The room froze. A student raised a hand. "Sir." "Who's Rivera?" He turned. "You'll know soon." Back in their apartment, Sophie and Lou sat at the window sharing a mug of soup. Snow had begun to fall, slow, reluctant flakes melting on the sill. Sophie whispered, "I think the shape is about balance." Lou smiled. "Like dance? Like gravity," she said. "Everything turning towards something." He nodded, though he didn't understand. But she did. And maybe now, so would the world. They published her silence. But truth remembers its voice. It began, as many quiet revolutions do, in the unassuming inbox of a minor academic journal. The journal of non-linear structures and theoretical forms was respected, but rarely read outside its niche. Its editors prided themselves on curating the unconventional, on publishing what others deemed too speculative. So, when an anonymous envelope arrived, no return address, no university seal, it was the sort of mystery that intrigued, not alarmed, the editorial board. Inside was a manuscript, typed, neatly formatted, equations scrolled through pages with delicate clarity, diagrams sketched in graphite, photographed in high resolution, each shape labeled with care. The title read, "Spiral Contraction Dynamics in Compact Topological Systems," and beneath it a single name, Sophie Rivera, age 11. There was no cover letter, no curriculum vitae, just the work. It was submitted on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the editorial team had scheduled an emergency peer review. Professor Hale did not know of the submission at first. He was in his office, a cup of untouched coffee on the desk beside him, staring once more at Sophie's notebook. Each day, he found new meaning in lines he had already memorized. He had begun writing his own notes in the margins, reactions, extensions, questions. But even his annotations looked clumsy beside her original geometry. There was a knock on his door. Clara. She entered without waiting. In her hand was a printout. Hale reached for his glasses. "You need to see this," she said. He scanned the title, then the author. He blinked. "This is real?" Peer review came back in 36 hours. All 3 reviewers called it original and field-defining. Hale leaned back in his chair. "How did she—" "Someone helped her submit it. My guess? Not from this campus." She paused. "It's being fast-tracked for publication." He closed his eyes. It was happening. Without his hand. Without his protection. Without his permission. And that was how it should be. Meanwhile, Sophie sat on the floor of the apartment, the carpet worn beneath her knees, a large sheet of butcher paper spread out before her. Lou had found it at the corner supply store, a teacher's leftover donation. Sophie had covered it in arcs, spirals, nested fields. With no margins left, she'd begun drawing on the back. Lou came home holding a stack of mail. He didn't speak right away. He sat down, opened a letter, and handed it to her. It was from the journal. She read the first line, lips moving silently. "Dear Miss Rivera, we are pleased to inform you that your manuscript has been accepted for publication." She stopped. Lou watched her. She looked up. "Is this real?" He nodded. She whispered, "They said my name." 2 days later, the news reached the mathematics department. It spread not with shouts, but with questions. "Have you seen this? Who submitted it? Wait, the Rivera model is real?" Within a week, her paper had been downloaded over 10,000 times. Universities in Europe began referencing it in research proposals. A conference organizer from Princeton reached out, delicately, inquiring if Miss Rivera might be available for a virtual Q&A. Hale declined on her behalf. She was still a child, still learning, still breathing. But the work had already left home. Miles Vance received the news with silence. He read the abstract, then the byline, then the citations already forming around the name he had tried to erase. His name was not among them. He closed his laptop and stared at his own blank notebook. Sophie didn't speak much about the article. Not at first, but she began to draw differently, with more space, more patience. She started labeling things, writing little notes to herself in the corners of her pages. Angle of balance. Inward motion prefers resistance. Time is not always forward. Lou would find the notebook open sometimes when she was asleep. He never touched it, but he would sit beside it, quietly, as if guarding something sacred. In April, the journal printed its quarterly issue. Her article was the first, her name full and clear on the cover. Sophie Rivera, 11 years old, from nowhere special, from no place at all, except here. Harvard doesn't credit ghosts, and to them she was invisible. On the morning Sophie's paper reached the university library archives, a whisper moved through the oldest stone halls of Harvard. Not a celebration. Not yet. More like discomfort shifting in a hard wooden chair. In the faculty lounge, someone said, "It's a prank, a hoax." Another countered, "The peer reviews were authentic, triple confirmed. She's 11. She's brilliant. She's the janitor's granddaughter." That final line stuck, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. And truth, when it doesn't fit the frame, becomes a splinter. Miles Vance sat in the back of his weekly seminar, eyes fixed on nothing. He didn't speak. He didn't look up when his name was called for a presentation. Clara noticed. So did Professor Hale. Later that day, Clara confronted him outside the math building. "She did it without us." Miles stared ahead. "She's not even supposed to be here." "She was never here, Miles. But the work was. You don't get it." "No, you don't." Clara walked away. And for the first time since Sophie had picked up that chalk, Miles felt it. Not anger, not jealousy. Shame. That evening, Professor Hale returned to his office to find something waiting. A small package. No label. Inside, a worn notebook. Sophie's. A sticky note read, "She asked me to return this. She's still drawing. Lou." Hale opened the notebook. The later pages were denser now. Spirals within spirals. Not just sketches, but systems. Proofs with soft smudges of graphite. Notes that blended observation with intuition. Symmetry isn't stillness, it's conversation. Curvature is choice. "She learns like someone listening to a language the rest of us forgot," Hale murmured. Then he saw it. A new shape. Nested topologies that wrapped around a hollow center. It wasn't empty. It was deliberate. A void designed to contain contradiction. He leaned back, stunned. The next day, Sophie and Lou walked past Harvard Yard together. She wasn't wearing her backpack, no notebook, just an old scarf of her grandmother's and Lou's coat draped around her shoulders. She looked up at the wrought iron gates and said, "Do I still belong here?" Lou didn't answer immediately. He stopped, pointed to the statue of John Harvard. "That man up there? The one they made into stone?" "Yeah." He never saw this place as it is now. He gave books and land. But this? He gestured to the walkways, the buildings, the students. This was built by people they never named, bricks laid by hands no one remembers, cleaned by men like me. But you? You wrote something they'll never erase. Sophie nodded. I don't need to belong, just to keep drawing. Back inside Maxwell Hall, Hale held a faculty seminar. No blackboard, no lecture, just a story. He read aloud Sophie's article. The entire thing, word by word. When he finished, no one moved. She has no formal training. She hasn't taken a single test. She's not a student here. But she saw what we didn't. That's what matters. One professor stood. We can't cite a child who isn't part of the university. Another. We already have. The room fractured. Arguments formed. Policy, protocol, credit. But amid it all, something undeniable hovered in the room. The spiral, the Rivera model, the work. The following week, a visiting researcher from Cambridge cited Sophie's paper in a public lecture. It spread to MIT, then Stanford. Sophie's name became a quiet hum across math circles worldwide. Still, at Harvard, no official word was given, no award, no invitation, no welcome. And yet, on the third floor of the mathematics library, tucked between topology journals, a plain white card was placed beneath a laminated printout of her paper. Author, Sophie Rivera. Not a student, not a name on a door. But there. Witnessed. One afternoon, as spring softened the edges of winter, Sophie and Lou sat on a bench outside the yard. Students passed by without noticing them. Sophie had a new notebook. Lou held 2 cups of cocoa. You want to go back in? He asked. No, she said. I want to see what happens next. You mean with the math? With people. He smiled. Then they sat in silence, the kind that doesn't press, doesn't rush, the kind that holds. Above them, the wind turned softly, and the branches overhead formed a shape that, from where Sophie sat, looked a little like a spiral. And no one expected her to speak. But when she did, even time listened. It happened on a Wednesday. A notice went out through the Harvard Mathematics Department mailing list. A special seminar had been added to the schedule. No title, no listed speaker, just a room, a time, and one line at the bottom. Attendance strongly encouraged. Word traveled fast. Students speculated. Faculty whispered. Some thought it was a last-minute colloquium. Others guessed it might be Hale announcing his retirement, or his apology. At precisely 6:00 p.m., Maxwell Hall was full. Professor Hale stood at the front of the room, stone-faced, as always. But something in his posture had shifted. Less command, more reverence. He cleared his throat and said, Before we begin, I'd like to ask that you put away your laptops and notebooks. Just watch and listen. Then he gestured to the chalkboard. Nothing was written there. Only a chair. A small chair. At the front of the room. Then the door opened, and Sophie Rivera walked in. She wore a simple navy sweater and jeans. Her shoes were too big, Lou's old pair, cleaned and polished. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear. She looked around at the rows of faces. Students, professors, postdocs, visiting fellows, none of whom had ever expected to see her like this. Some blinked. Some straightened in their seats. A few smiled, cautiously. Sophie walked to the front. She did not sit. She picked up a piece of chalk. The room held its breath. I don't know how to give a lecture, she began. Her voice was soft. But I can show you what I saw. She drew a curve, then a spiral. Then, beside it, a second spiral. This one inverted. "You already know this," she said. "You just forgot to feel it." The chalk moved again. Lines connected. Arrows formed. A topology unfolded across the board like a song no one had heard in years but somehow remembered. "You called it unstable," she continued. "You said the boundary condition collapses the flow, but that's only true if you expect the energy to leave." She turned to them. "What if it wants to stay?" Hale stood to the side, arms crossed, but his eyes glistened. The equations Sophie wrote weren't just elegant. They were intuitive. She moved with rhythm, pausing only when the board ran out of space. Then she stopped, stepped back, and waited. The room was silent. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Another joined. Then the whole room. Not a roar, a rising, like light warming a room at dawn. After the lecture, no one left right away. They came up, one by one, not to congratulate, but to ask, to wonder, to learn. And Sophie answered each of them quietly. No arrogance, no performance, only clarity. She did not belong to Harvard. But in that moment, Harvard belonged to her. Back in the hallway, Lou stood with his mop cart parked beside him, arms folded, tears in his eyes, not of pride, of something deeper, recognition. A janitor's granddaughter had walked into the oldest room of the oldest college in America and redrew its future with a piece of chalk. Hale approached him. "She taught us something we forgot." Lou nodded. "She's always been watching, listening." "I want her here," Hale said. "Officially, she needs a place to grow." Lou looked down the hallway where Sophie now stood, surrounded by people who had once ignored her. "She already started," he said. That night, back in their apartment, Sophie opened her new notebook. She drew 2 spirals again. Then, carefully, she connected them with a bridge. Underneath, she wrote, "Knowledge is a place we build, not just enter." Lou watched her from across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. For the first time, her name wasn't whispered. It was honored. Spring came slow that year. Boston thawed gently, like it too was trying to make peace with what had been hidden beneath the frost. Maxwell Hall still stood quiet most mornings, but something had shifted in the way its doors opened. The building felt less like a monument and more like a home, even if just for one name. Sophie Rivera. The name began appearing in places no one expected. On slides during lectures, in bibliographies, in the small print at the bottom of research posters. At first, people said it softly, uncertain whether they were allowed to say it at all. Then, with wonder. Then, eventually, with respect. Not because she was 11, but because her work refused to be forgotten. In the library, a quiet retraction was issued. The earlier paper submitted by Miles Vance and his group, the one that had borrowed Sophie's model without her name, was withdrawn. No press release. No formal announcement, just a digital note at the top of the archive, retracted by authors for ethical review. Clara submitted the request herself. Miles didn't fight it. He'd stopped coming to seminars, stopped raising his hand. No one said anything cruel. They didn't have to. He erased himself. Meanwhile, Sophie kept working. Not for school, not for praise. For curiosity. She had started mapping how spiral dynamics might influence fluid mechanics, wondering how energy swirled differently through water or wind when guided by symmetry. Lou sometimes came home to find the bathtub half-filled, her notebook open on the floor, paper boats drifting in concentric circles. He never interrupted, just watched, learned, remembered. Then one day, a letter arrived. Not from a journal, not from a professor, from the president of Harvard. The envelope was thick, the paper cream-colored, the font formal. Dear Miss Rivera, it would be our privilege to invite you to present your work in person at the Spring Research Convocation as a special guest. It was signed with blue ink, not printed. Lou read it twice, then handed it to her. Sophie read it, then folded it. I'm not sure I belong at something like that, she said. Lou smiled. You already were. They just finally noticed. The convocation was held in Sanders Theater, a domed hall of carved wood, velvet seats, and history pressed into every inch. Its walls had echoed with the voices of Nobel laureates, philosophers, presidents, and now they would hear hers. Sophie didn't wear anything fancy, just a clean dress, her grandmother's scarf, and a rubber band around her wrist for holding pencils. She stood beside Professor Hale, who had introduced her not as a prodigy, not as a miracle, but simply someone who helped us remember how to see. Sophie took the podium. She didn't use slides. She held up her notebook. This is how it started, she said. Just drawing what I saw. When things didn't make sense, I'd try to draw the shape of the question. She flipped to the spiral. This shape doesn't belong to me. It's in nature, in wind, in shells, in how we turn toward each other when we're listening. She paused. When I first came to Harvard, I didn't know if I was allowed to be here. My grandfather cleans these halls. My mother works nights at the hospital. I don't come from books or theory. I come from watching, from quiet. She turned the page. This model, it's not just math. It's the idea that energy doesn't always leave, that sometimes it stays and builds. She looked at the room. This place didn't expect me, but I hope it remembers me. Not because I was young or poor or unexpected, but because I helped build something real. Silence, then a rising. Not applause, not yet, but a standing. Row by row, people stood. Lou stood, tears in his eyes, the kind that come when you finally see something you've always believed made real. Her name was printed in the program, in bold. Sophie Rivera. Not an asterisk, not a footnote, a headline. Afterward, professors lined up to speak with her. Some asked about theory. Some just shook her hand. A visiting scholar from Germany said, "You remind me of Emmy Noether." Sophie didn't know the name. She would learn it later. Then she'd understand what kind of compliment that was. That night in their apartment, Lou made arroz con leche, the way Elena used to. Cinnamon, slow heat, the kind of sweetness that sticks to memory. Sophie sat at the table, drawing a new pattern. Not spirals, not yet, just lines, straight ones, but underneath they curved, just a little. She looked up. I want to teach someday. Lou nodded. You already are. She smiled and wrote her name again at the top of the page. Not small, not hidden, in full. Years later, a building was renamed. A small lecture hall in Maxwell Hall, once called Seminar Room B, was given a new plaque, the Rivera Room underneath. For those who see what others forget. And inside a framed copy of Sophie's first spiral, drawn not for recognition, but for truth, for the beauty of staying, for the courage to begin. There will always be rooms where you are not expected. Places that feel too grand for your footsteps, too polished for your voice. But what Sophie Rivera taught us, What every quiet genius tucked behind a mop cart or a night shift has to teach is this: you do not have to ask permission to see the world differently. You do not have to wear the right name or come from the right place to leave behind something that matters, because truth is not owned, it is witnessed. And one spiral, drawn by steady hands in the shadows, can turn even the oldest walls into open doors.